Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today, my guest is Ryan Stevens, who's a longtime Twitter mutual of mine and founder of dialedinmen.com. Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, Dean, thanks so much for having me. I think, like I told you beforehand, it's been a while since I've done one of these, so I'm looking forward to it and excited, and hopefully can shake off some of this rust.
We were talking right before we began recording, and you and I have been mutuals for years at the very least. How have things been going for you with regard to your life on Twitter?
Yeah, so I certainly, since the algorithms changed, I don't get as much engagement as I have previously, but I don't really concern myself with the vanity metrics that come with Twitter. I like just connecting with sharp, like-minded mutuals such as yourself. I think for me, Twitter is a way to share some things that I'm learning as I go on about my life, some things I'm interested in, and it's really about putting those signals and breadcrumbs out into the world and seeing who responds to those. And a lot of times the people that respond to those are people that I like to build a community with and connect with and learn from. And so for me, it's really just about that relationship building, and it's a way for me to kind of work with the garage door open, if you will. It's like, here are some things that I'm doing that I find interesting, and putting that signal into the world and seeing how people respond to it.
Why is it important to put those breadcrumbs into the world?
I think for me, it's a little bit of accountability. So it's like, here are some things that I'm doing, and by putting it out into the world, it's like, it holds me accountable to, like, I'm adding value or trying to add value to people's lives. And, again, it goes back to the relationship building. And so it's like, when I'm sharing the things that I'm interested in or that I'm learning about, it opens the door for people to say, oh, that's interesting. I haven't thought about that. Let's have a conversation about that. And so, I've connected with so many sharp people. In the world we live in today, we should probably put our phones down more often. And I think about sometimes when I'm getting reprimanded for being on my phone when I probably should be paying attention to something else. And I'm like, I hear what you're saying, but also the sheer volume of really smart people on this app sharing wisdom is just continues to be mind-boggling to me.
Yes, I often think that too. When let's say I'm in a meeting, and I know it would be ill-advised to pick up my phone and scroll Twitter. I often think, well, why is it my obligation to not read Twitter right now and not your obligation to be at least as interesting as the people there? Right?
If it's funny, the first time that occurred to me was in college. You get reprimanded if you're not paying attention to the lecture. And I get it. You want to be respectful to your professor, but at the same time, I had that same inclination. Is like, I'm paying this university. So, it's your job to teach me, to engage me, so if you're not doing those things and I can learn more about the topic we're talking about from someone on this device, I'm going to go look at that device sometimes. And again, it's marrying that respect and personalization and engagement, but also, like, it's certainly a draw. It is.
Yeah, part of it too is just living in a transition time where the example you gave of being in the lecture. So we've lived in a transition time where we're transitioning from these sorts of brick and mortar ways of delivering ideas, content, etc. We're transitioning from that to digital spaces, for good or for ill. But there will probably be a day where people won't experience the tension of feeling like they want to get on Twitter during a lecture because they won't be in lectures. But you and I have lived during that transition time, so there's an inherent tension built into it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the only thing I would add to that is, like, it's one thing to be drawn to that space and to always be quote unquote learning, but true learning is taking the time to apply what you learn. So, if we're just looking at Twitter and scrolling Twitter and never doing anything with the things that we're learning, or we're not connecting with the people that we're learning from, then it's kind of wasted time. And so
Yep.
that's the only thing I would add to that is like when we learn or when we need to go connect with these people or we need to change our behavior or we need to take action on the things that we're learning.
Speaking of learning and growing and developing, just tell us in brief what dialedinmen.com is all about.
That was a great segue. You're experienced at this podcasting thing. I like it.
It,
Yeah, so
it only works if you don't draw attention to how smooth I am.
touche, fair enough. Um, so my wife and I actually started Dialed In Men after my first my we had a son in 2016. So after he was born, I really started paying attention to the things being said about men, and I'm
Mhm.
trying to raise a young man. And I just really didn't like a lot of the discourse out there. And I've always been kind of a personal development type person, always trying to improve myself. And so my wife and I said, well, what if we start this site that ultimately educates people on like what the state of men is, because we're trying to raise this little human. And then if we really try to find, excuse me, scientifically backed research. Like we want it to be not just our N plus one, even though there's merit in that too. But where's the scientific based research on how we can improve ourselves in the lives of men? Let's write these articles. Let's share them on this website. That helps other people. It helps us as we learn and grow ourselves. But then we ultimately have a repository for our son that he could go look at when he gets older, that he could say, oh, this is great insight. And so that's kind of the way we've thought about it. We've since had another son, we have a daughter, and so we think about it as like, what if worst case scenario, something happens to us? Here's a repository of things we've thought about and knowledge that we've shared that our kids could go read about and learn from.
So you started because you were concerned about the state of men. What is the state of men?
Yeah, so it it's a tricky conversation to have in large part because historically men have been in positions of power and privilege in America. I think most people would acknowledge that. And so men are not doing as well right now, is the reality that we live in. And, some people will say, well, we don't have a lot of sympathy. It's our turn now. But the problem is there's lots of second order things happening as a result of men not doing as well right now. And so when I say not doing as well right now, the average American man dies 5 years earlier than the average American woman. 75% of all suicides are committed by men. This has gone up more than 40% since the late 90s. Over 90% of our inmates are male. Women outnumber men in graduate school. They earn the majority of doctorate, law, medical degrees. There's 7 million plus men, working age men, that are no longer in the labor force. They're not being even counted in the jobs reports that the president puts out. 1 in 5 children live in single mother households. That's double the rate since 1970. 70% of men are overweight or obese. Testosterone levels are declining precipitously. So there's lots of things going on. And I think that narrative is hard for people to talk about because historically men have been in positions of power and privilege.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you see it lots of places on Twitter, for example. And one of the ways I think you see what you might call a second order effect of men's decline is the level of unhappy women on Twitter. And I don't think that we can separate the decline of men from women's level of, well, fulfillment. So I guess the question is, why should women be invested in what's happening with men, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, look, I want to be transparent here. There's people that know more about this topic than I do that have some really good insights. Professor Scott Galloway at NYU is somebody who's delved into this a little bit. I haven't dived as deep as he is, just because, again, it's kind of a sensitive topic for a lot of people. I think where it matters most is finding a viable mate, right? We know that married people are wealthier, they're happier, they live longer. There's a large reduction in childhood poverty when you live in a community that has more married couples. Um, but the issue is that women want men with earning power. That's the reality. They say, "Oh, I have my own career. I don't need no man." All of these narratives that happen out there, and maybe in some ways that's more true than it used to be. But when you poll women, 71% of them want a man with high earning power. Men, on the other hand, that's about 25%. So it doesn't matter as much to men. But if men are dropping out of the workforce, if they're not earning as much money, if they have mental health issues, if they're lonely and poorly educated, like that's a bomb waiting to explode. And so, I think social and digital have exacerbated this problem as well, because if you look at these dating apps, which is where, let's acknowledge the fact that that's where most people find their mates now, at least people younger than the two of us, a lot of these women focus their attention on those top 10% of men. Don't blame them, but what are the other 90% of men doing? So there's this mate strategy that is really imbalanced right now. And I think it's multifaceted, it's very complicated, but I think that's a lot of what's going on when you talk about why are women more unhappy.
Mm. As you have kind of put these breadcrumbs into the world, what kind of feedback have you gotten from men about specifically what they are struggling with? And I suppose the question then is related to that: how do you choose what article goes up on dialedinmen.com? Right? Because I would think those articles are meant to address the things that you're seeing.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that feedback loop is probably not as tight as it should be. A lot of times it's what's going on Dialed In Men is something we've encountered with our kids that we're like, we're going to go explore this in more depth and then share that article. I would say, a lot of men are just trying to figure out how to do it all. I think there's a lot more pressure. Again, going back to social media and our phones, we have examples of the top tier or what people are portraying as the top tier on social media. And so men are like, well, I have to be jacked. I have to be rich. I have to be attractive. And it's something that's unattainable. So, I think a lot of the breadcrumbs I'm putting out is like, focus on one of these things and improve yourself in that area of life as best as you can. So we have articles on Dialed In Men that are like, if we were telling somebody, here's the 5 tips to get your finances as dialed in as possible, here are those 5 tips. It could be, the one we recently published, I think was like, I'm so busy at work, but I want to be a present father. How do I navigate that tension? And so it's like, here are simple ways you can spend time with your kid where even if you're not spending the most amount of time, you're still present. Again, back to your point, what I see and what I don't engage with as much is there are a lot of men that are getting disenfranchised, that are getting unhappy, that are following role models that I may or may not believe are the best types of role models for them. And I kind of, rather than try to fight that urge, I let them like, you go do that. And hopefully you realize that maybe this isn't for me and you'll come back to something that's more, because of the age of our kids. I think we focus a lot more on like, how can new parents engage? How can busy fathers engage? If that makes sense.
It seems to me that we've seen a number of kinds of responses to the ongoing crisis among men. I probably started reading what would now be considered a manosphere type material probably 20 years ago. And since then, if you've paid attention at all, it's pretty clear to see how things have transitioned to the point where now what is kind of what we might even think of as the successors to the manosphere are almost laughable. I think we've come to a point where certain kind of even what we might have once thought of as sort of red pill kind of content or leaders in the kind of the red pill movement, they have kind of faded out to cede the, it seems to me like the social spotlight to guys who are either utterly bitter incels or just obvious profiteers who are sort of trying to take the crisis of men and monetize it through a podcast. What do you think about those guys? What are they helpful to men, do you think, really?
Yeah, so here's what I think. I think, again, going back to the digital and social world we live in, it feels like to me it rewards the extremes. And so, because of the nature of digital and social, there doesn't feel, podcasts aside, perhaps, nobody has the attention span for longer articles anymore. But there's not a lot of nuance in these conversations. So, a lot of times, what you're finding is a disenfranchised man who has just gone through a divorce, a bitter breakup, been accused of being an incel, things like that. And they start pulling on threads. And maybe there's a kernel of truth to that manosphere caricature that is like, yeah, I need to improve myself. I need to get more fit. And so they start there. And then it takes them down a rabbit hole that is not where I believe men should be, to your point, to where maybe it is full on misogyny, if you will. And I think there are certainly bad faith actors out there preying on that and taking advantage of that. And I think disenfranchised young men are very vulnerable to that. And that's where I go back to like, my hope is that, and I know men that you and I are mutuals with that have gone down that path and were capable of saying, I got what I needed out of that and got right back out. And now I have this more nuanced view and now I'm more balanced. And now, I follow other people that are better fathers or better leaders. So my hope is that some of that is happening. But the reality is there's many that just go down that path and stay down that path. And I think those men are invariably contributing to some of the bad stats that I mentioned earlier.
I suppose that what we're saying is that when it comes to the crisis among men, the cures that the internet has provided are sometimes worse than the disease, or they at least exacerbate your disease in a way.
Yeah, I think so. And I also think some of the men that have that perceived success, whether it's real or perceived, I don't know. Depends on what they want out of life, I guess. Men look at, for example, somebody like Dan Bilzerian, who had a lot of money and is surrounded by a lot of women, and they perceive that to be the type of life they want to live. And so they start going down that path. And the reality is 2% of them are going to achieve the level of wealth and desirability from females that he has. And so they're going to go down that path. They're not going to get what he has. And now they're going to fall in this group that is more disenfranchised, more frustrated, and being vocal about how much they dislike women because those women aren't infatuated with them like they are Dan. Funny thing about Dan is now he's admitted as being like, look, I just want a family now. Like, This was a vain, and I think, again, it goes back to some people have to kind of go through that process. But yeah, I think part of that is what's happening is like, again, online and digital reward the extremes. So I'm seeing this top tier talent and I'm trying to get there and I can't. And so now I'm even more disenfranchised and more frustrated, which is why we need the more nuanced conversations. And we need leaders that are like, look, I'm just a father trying to juggle it all. Or, I'm pretty fit, but my career hasn't grown that much because I have 3 young kids and I'm focused on, being a present father. We need more of those types of leaders, but those stories aren't as fascinating, especially for social media, in the ADH world that we live in today.
It's almost like the digital structure of things creates a binary narrative for young men where either they're the top or they're total failures. And so what happens, I guess what you're saying is what happens is that the number of bitter young men grows because there's no middle ground between being, billionaire playboy and total abject loser.
Yeah, I think you have to really be intentional about what you're trying to achieve. I always tell people if you're using social media, um, to compare yourself to people 10 levels ahead of you, you're always going to feel dissatisfied. You really need, if you're going to use it to compare, which maybe you shouldn't in the first place, but if you're going to use it to compare, use it to someone who's like 1 year ahead of you. I want to start a business. Don't look at Tim Ferriss or Ramit Sethi. Look at somebody that's 1 year ahead of you. Then it's like, oh, I can do that. That's viable. Here's some steps I can take. And, I think the same thing goes for men. Stop. You're not going to be Tom Brady. So find a man who is like, he's just a father who owns a business. Or, he's a single guy and this is how he's getting really fit so that he can build his business so that he's financially adept when he wants to start dating and have a family and things like that. And I think those people are out there and they exist, but people don't know what they're looking for. So they're just looking at what's getting the most clicks and most likes. And that is these extreme outliers.
I think too that there is something almost in the nature of men that loves hierarchy, but also tends to be in denial about it. So you brought up Tom Brady. I'm a big baseball fan. So you watch any there you go. Watch any major league game, and let's say Aaron Judge, fantastic player for the Yankees in the World Series, he dropped the ball. It ended up ultimately costing them the game and maybe the World Series. But you get online after any of these games and you see lots of guys who couldn't run around the block telling you what the world's most elite athletes, what they would have done in that situation. And so there's something almost in the nature of of a man's mind to sort of admire the top 1% while also denying the fact that they just don't have that level of ability.
Yeah,
Do you think
that's
so?
a fascinating observation, and it's one that I haven't thought a lot about. But um, you know, off the top of my head, I keep coming back to this world we live in where so much is digital and social.
Mm-hmm.
And there's the famous "Man in the Arena" poem, right? And I just think
Mm-hmm.
my wife and I talk about this with our son a little bit. He's a smaller kid, pretty athletic, but he's just smaller physically than some of his peers. But you watch them wrestle in person, and he gets this sense of like, in this hierarchy, this is where I fall. Maybe I don't want to wrestle this kid that's 2 heads taller than me and stronger than me. So in the physical world, I think you see this and you internalize it. But when it's digital,
Mm-hmm.
you can just sit there and be an armchair quarterback, or you can critique like, oh, I would have caught that fly ball.
Right.
Look, yeah, you would have caught 50% of them. Aaron Judge catches 99.9% of them. He just happened to miss that one. And so, I think that is a little bit of the at play, but I also just think it's an inherent dissatisfaction in their life where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
let's cut down someone else um, because I'm unhappy. And I think there's a little bit of that happens too.
Yes, I think maybe this is what you're getting at, that lots of guys have a kind of inherent dissatisfaction with their own life. And then when you marry that with the sort of disembodying tendency of digital spaces, They no longer have to be rooted to the realities of who they are. And so it becomes even easier to assume, to think at some level that you have the potential to be Aaron Judge and hit 57 home runs or whatever in the season, like last year, without necessarily ever having to encounter anything in the physical world that reminds you that you don't have that potential. And then your life is even more of a constant disappointment because you have sort of an outsized sense of what you ought to be able to do versus the reality of what you're actually doing.
Yeah, so that's a great point, and I have an example. When we live in this online world, we can insulate ourselves in these bubbles, right? Where we're getting constant reinforcement. We can also try to create this avatar of ourselves, like whose Twitter profile is their actual true self. Like if you saw somebody's Twitter profile, is that the same person that you know as your neighbor, or has he built themselves up to something bigger? So I grew up in a town that wasn't necessarily small. It was about 35,000, played baseball. So bringing it back to the baseball conversation, was a pretty good middle infielder, was like, hey, I want to play college baseball. There was some signs that like, yeah, maybe I'm good enough to play college baseball. Had really good grades. So I was like, I'm in Huntsville, so about an hour north of Houston is where I grew up. So I was like, let's go down to Houston. Let's watch the Rice baseball team, who at the time had Neiman, Townsend, Umber, like all these guys go pro. So went to watch them and was like, I have good grades. Maybe I can go to Rice. I watched Paul Yanish for about 30 seconds, and I was like, oh, there's layers to this. Like, I need to find a different school to play college baseball because Paul Yanish is better at 18 or whatever than I will ever be ever. Like it was just, but I had lived in my bubble and I had played against good players. But I just watched him and I remember feeling like, oh, there's levels to this, and that's one I'm never going to. So I need to change my. But like you can let yourself be discouraged by that and be like, well, I should just quit baseball. Forget my dream of playing college baseball. That guy's way better than me. It wasn't. It was just adjusting the expectations. It was like that's unrealistic, and I'm going to be really frustrated if I think that's my ceiling. My ceiling's here, and that's okay.
Yeah, and I think it's important too for guys to say, my ceiling on baseball is here. But I also think there is something very deep in the masculine spirit that drives men to want to excel. So I remember hearing a story about Bruce Springsteen once when he was beginning, and he said he thought to himself, "I will never be the world's greatest guitarist, and I don't have the world's greatest singing voice. Maybe what I could do is write the world's greatest lyrics." And, we could debate. I don't think anybody would say Springsteen has not been a great lyricist over the course of his career. But the point is that he had that drive to excel in a way, but he was coming up in the late 60s when it wasn't as easy to deceive yourself about what your potential is, and therefore
Yeah.
fall into terrible depression or
Well,
plays.
I think it's a great point. I think about David Senra's Founders podcast, which is just a great podcast. But what he talks about is like he's basically telling you about these founders' success, and it's outsized success as a founder. But he goes into their entire lives, and what you realize is that these are not necessarily stories to aspire to, because while most of them achieved outsized success in business, their marriages crumbled. They didn't have great relationships with friends. And that's not always the case, but I think he uses the word, a lot of these are things you can learn from with respect to business, but they're a cautionary tale in other aspects of life. And so, I'm pretty upfront about that when people are trying to quote unquote get dialed in, is like, if you are ripped to shreds, 8% body fat, jacked, deadlift 600 pounds, all those things, but you're not being a good father, are you winning? If you're making 400,000 a year at XYZ company, but you're working 80 hours a week and you never see your kids. Are you winning? So to me, being dialed in is trying to find that balance that works for you and acknowledging that there's different seasons of life. And sometimes you need to lean into the career and sometimes you need to, focus on your health because it suffered. And sometimes you need to, spend more time with your kids because they're at an age where you can have a lot of influence.
Mhm.
And so, when your kids are teenagers and they don't want to hang out with you anymore, go get ripped again.
Mm.
And so that's kind of one of the things that I talk about with being dialed in is like, how do you find that balance at the right time? And it kind of goes back to your point is like, and where can I win? And
Mm.
I think that's something that we need to spend more time focused on. What am I uniquely good at that people care about? And let's go win in that sphere and let's be as good as we can in the others without stressing too much if we're not elite in those.
Right. And so I think part of, I guess, the point we're making is that for many young men, the question, where can I win, is almost muted because social media sort of suggests to them, if you don't win everywhere all the time, that the definition of a loser is someone who doesn't win in all areas all the time, when that's just not reality. Right.
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% true. I think and I don't think enough people spend enough time being intentional about, and again, we're inundated by constant, you know, signals of these folks being successful in these aspects of their lives. But I think people need to spend some time being really intentional about what matters most to me now and how
Mhm.
can I spend a vast majority of my time being successful at those things that I know matter to me and letting the other stuff fall by the wayside. And that's okay, within reason. And so I think, if I could encourage anybody to do something actionable, it would be to actually like sit down, like, what are you uniquely good at? Ask your friends, let them tell you. Because a lot of times they, may know better than you. What would you spend time doing for free? Um, you know, anyway, how can you figure out how to do more of that? How can you figure out how to monetize that? Don't, I'm going down a path here. You don't always need to monetize your hobbies, and that's what I'm not trying to say that, but I think people need to spend time figuring out what is most important in their lives right now and how do they focus on that. And it's okay if they're not the most physically fit person ever because they're leaning into another aspect of their life at this time.
So young men now are in a crisis, maybe even older men are in a crisis. What's the way out of that?
I think it's a lot of the things that we've been talking about. I think social media is influencing a lot of this. And so it goes back to, if you're going to use social media, use it to put the breadcrumbs out into the world and create a like-minded community of men. I think men are often told, kids in elementary school, especially boys, are told, sit down, be quiet, be still. Not the most optimal learning environment for men. You get older, men complain about things, and there's a meme of like a woman telling a man like, "Hey, I want to hear about your problems," and they're to get sitting next together on the park bench. The man starts sharing the problems, and then the next screen is the man sitting on the park bench by himself. I think some of that is true. Men are told to man up, and again, that's part of the reason why men have mental health issues. So I think but men and women communicate differently, and so does a man need to be sharing his problems with women, his spouse, maybe his mom, maybe, but not necessarily. Like men need to find community with other men. And so I think, again, goes back to using social to compare yourself to people who are at your level or slightly above, connect to those people, be proactive about that connection, strengthen your relationships with men. I think kind of what I was saying a minute ago too, like really audit what your inputs are and audit like the type of man you like. Picture yourself. One exercise I do with my coaching is like, let's say it's a year from now. What does your ideal self look like? And then how do you work backwards to become that ideal person? And I think, again, it's about that intentionality. It's about spending time auditing what's going on in your life so that you can replace things that are not good use of your time with skill building, with developing relationships, with those kinds of things so that you can become that person you're trying to become.
So let's imagine we've got a young guy out there who's pretty black pilled. Okay, he's bummed out. He's a doomer. What would you suggest are some of the fundamental mind shifts that he's going to need to make? Mindset shifts, I guess, that he's going to need to make if he's going to get dialed in or even just get to a more satisfactory way of living.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And it's hard. I want to be careful here. This is kind of a universal example, and it's hard without knowing more specifics, right? Because I think if you spend time with that person, you diagnose some of what's going on and try to steer them accordingly. I always tell people the first thing to do is start being more physical, start working out a little bit. Doesn't have to be a lot, couple
Why
times
is
a
that the
week.
first thing you say?
Why, you said?
Why? Yeah, why is that the first?
Because I think it has compounding benefits across the spectrum. I think if you're trying to if you here's three things. If you pick up and put down heavy things twice a week, try to get 8,000 steps a day or so, and try to sleep 7+ hours. I think if you do those three things, you're going to have more clarity of mind. You're going to, if you can do it consistently for just a short amount of time, you're going to start feeling and seeing differences. And I think seeing some of that momentum is helpful so that you can have momentum in other aspects of life. But I just think there's so much compounding nature in being a little bit more physically fit because now you feel better, you have more strength of mind, more mental clarity. It's something that is very tangible that you can track and do. I could tell somebody like, hey, if you're really black pilled, go do therapy. But most black pilled people are going to be like, therapy's not going to work for me. I get it. I totally do. And there's a lot of research that shows maybe therapy is not great for men. So I always say good therapy is picking up and putting down heavy things. It's getting some sunlight early in the morning to fix your circadian rhythm. It's getting that sleep. It's moving. I would also tell people like literally do an audit of your life. What are the habits that bring you joy? Who are the people that, you feel lifted up by, that you get energy from, and who are the people that are energy vampires? And, if unless that's your parents and that's a whole broader conversation or your spouse or whatever, like get rid of the energy vampires, spend more time with the people that bring energy into your life. It really is about doing that audit and saying, what's one area that I can focus on right now to start getting dialed in? And when you get that one area dialed in, and oftentimes it is that physical health, because that physical health improves the mental health as well, then you start getting that ball rolling. So that's usually where I tell people to start.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What's the resistance that you encounter to doing that? You ever? First of all, tell us you work with men directly.
Yeah, predominantly men, often new fathers that I work less with that disenfranchised. I'm a 24, 26-year-old man who is following, wants to be Andrew Tate or Dan Bilzerian or somebody like that. My demographic that I work with is more like I'm a young father. I'm trying to juggle it all. I want to be a good dad. I want to show them that, being successful in your career is a good thing. That's kind of the folks that I'm working with.
All right. Well, then let me ask you this. So you're working with a lot of young fathers. Okay. What is it about the guys that you're working with that allowed them to even get to the point of being a young father? Right? What did they have that let them achieve that level of success that some guys might be missing?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Because being a young father, you're at least at, for a lot of guys, that's at least the minor leagues.
Yeah,
Like there are
no,
millions of
I
men that would
agree.
aspire
Having a
to
family,
desire that.
we talked about earlier, being married, happier, healthier, all of
Right.
those things. Yeah, I would say, and this is an interesting one because there's a huge narrative around the fact that we don't need higher education anymore on Twitter. That you can learn, you know, via the internet. That the trades, which there's a lot of research to show that we do need more blue collar jobs. I would say a lot of the guys I'm working with, though, what they had in common is that most of them did get a college degree. Now, how much did they learn or do they use their major? I don't know, but they met people in college of the opposite sex, or
Mhm.
you know, they learned from that experience, not just what they learned in school, but what they learned socially that they could use when they are now out of college to continue connecting with people. Um, I think a lot of them come from families where their parents had some level of guidance in their life. Their parents were still together, or if they weren't together, they were engaged in their life and wanted them to be successful. Um, I think generally speaking, I just think those folks did in some ways have a leg up. And I do think higher education was a piece of that, which is why I'm always reticent to be like, hey, we don't need higher education because that may or may not be true for some people, but it goes back to these outliers. Most people are not going to have the discipline to like, hey, let me go learn all of these things I need to know that I would have been forced to learn in higher education.
It's interesting. As a person who has spent a lot of time in higher education, both as a student and as a professor, I sometimes sort of just tell kids, you don't have to be here. There are other ways to get everything, knowledge wise that you would get here. But the reason that most of them actually go to college at all is that they simply don't have the drive to do anything else. And that part of the advantage, the remaining advantage of sort of traditional brick and mortar higher education for guys is that to enter the world and make a way for yourself without that requires a level of risk taking and focus and savviness that a lot of guys just don't want to develop. So you don't need to go to college to be a graphic design major because there's you can there's literally a billion places online to learn graphic design. What you have to do though is to basically be the kind of guy who has enough passion for what you want to do professionally to be able to show people that you are an exceptional graphic designer. I remember in Steve Martin's memoir about becoming a stand-up, somebody asked him, "Well, how do you get noticed as a stand-up? How do you break in? How do you even get to the level where you're just stably touring?" And his advice was, "Be so good they can't ignore you." And college is in a way a shortcut to that, right? Because you don't have to take it on yourself to be so good they can't ignore you, because your degree is like a stamp that somebody else said, "Hey, this guy's okay." So all of that to come down to this underlying question, which is, do you think that part of the issue with men now is just that they lack a certain kind of fire? And that seems like that would correlate with lower testosterone levels.
Yeah, I don't know that the real here's it's impossible to know for sure is what I would say, which is a way I like to answer many questions that I don't know. It's impossible to know for sure. I don't know that I would say, and I'm not tapped into 18-year-old kids right now, but I don't know that I would say younger kids necessarily lack the fire. I think a lot of times with the masculinity crisis is that the fire's getting beaten out of them.
Sure. Well,
Um,
if it's beat out, they lack it. Right? I mean, the fire
right,
is
right.
diminished one way or another, right?
Yeah, I don't. I think K through 12 education is not optimal for
Hmm.
boys. I think being told you have always been the oppressor. There's a certain demographic of men that are like, screw you, that's not true. Or historically, that may be true, but that's not true right now. I'm still going to go do XYZ. There's a lot of people that internalize all of that and like, oh, I'm the oppressor. Oh, I'm bad. Oh, I've always been a problem. I need to step back and let these other people shine. And so, to that extent, I do think there's potentially a fire that's invariably beat out of a certain group of men.
Mhm.
Um, I think it's hard to say because it's a spectrum, and so it's hard to say where along the path people get lost. Yes, college is a stamp of approval, but a lot of times college is I learned how to grow up, I learned how to talk to the opposite sex. I learned what I didn't want to do. I know so many people who went to school with a lot. There's not very many 18-year-old kids that know exactly what they want to do. So it's like you go to college, you want to be a journalist, you want to be um, a teacher, you want all these things, and you get there and you start learning more about that, and you're like, oh, maybe that's not for me. And so you navigate a path differently, and to some extent, it's an expensive path. I think we need to get high school counselors and parents, everybody better about like this is who higher education is probably for. But there's nothing wrong with these trades either, because a lot of times what we're doing is we're pushing young men to higher education that aren't suited for higher education. They would be much better off going into a trade.
Mhm.
But the reality is they get into school, they spend a year and a half, 2 years there, they accumulate debt, and they never get the degree. And now they go do the trade anyway, but they're behind. Whereas if they were 18 years old and they just started the trade, or they just did some, national service for the U.S. or whatever that looks like, I think we need a place where men and women can learn more of what they want to do, and they're not learning that in high school. And
Mhm.
so college potentially serves as a place for that too.
Young father who might be listening to this, what's your best word for him?
It's back to audit your inputs, figure out what is the most important things in your life. Presumably, one of those things is your family, and then set out to create a personal operating system that works for you. Like when you have high energy, and you won't always have high energy chasing kids around, build systems for consistency in your life so that you can still get some kind of workout in, so that you can focus at work and not be distracted by all of the other things going on in your life. I would also encourage young fathers, like, don't just rely on your spouse as your companionship. Keep those relationships with other men. Like, go have a drink with the buddies, play the fantasy football, whatever it is that you can maintain relationships so that your spouse is not your everything. Your spouse is one piece of your life, an important and a key piece, but not your everything. As soon as your spouse is your everything, that's way too much pressure to put on another person.
What do you mean by build systems? What do those look like?
So they look different for everybody. I have a dialed in dashboard for myself that's like just a rudimentary Excel file. I tried putting it in Notion. I didn't like that. It's just an Excel file. But it's like these are the things that I really want to do every day. And if I do these things every day, I know that most times I'm going to be in a good state of mind. I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be a better father. And for me, that is, a run or a workout. It's sunlight first thing in the morning. It's, am I blocking time for deep work at work so that I'm not bringing work home in the evenings? It's reading a little bit of fiction because, that helps me go to sleep at night and not spend time scrolling or, watching screens, which keeps me awake, which adversely affects my sleep. So again, I think it's figuring out on my Twitter right now. My pinned tweet is like, what does dialed in mean to me? And I outline what that looks like for me, acknowledging that it looks different for everybody else. But I have a dashboard in Excel where it's just like, here's the 8 things I want to do every day, and here's the days. And the more boxes I have filled in, the better my life is going to be, traditionally speaking. And I audit that periodically and say, let's get rid of this one. I used to have 100 push-ups a day on there, and I started getting stronger through my chest and shoulders, but also started having a shoulder problem. And I talked to Ajax on Twitter, and he was like, dude, you're doing way too much push-ups without doing any back. So he's like, you have no balance. So I got rid of the 100 push-ups. And like, but again, that goes back to building community with folks that know things more than you that you can tap into.
If a guy wants to work with you, how does he reach you?
Sending me a Twitter DM works just fine. If not, my email is ryan@dialedinmen.com.
Okay, great. And last thing, what any predictions for the 2025 baseball season?
My prediction is that my Astros will no longer be a dynasty in the AL West.
Yes. Unfortunately, that's probably true. My fear is that we're going to end up with a Subway World Series where it's going to be the Mets and the Yankees. Now, that's my fear. Not predicting that because Soto has gone from the Yankees to the Mets, so that and they did well last year. So I'm hoping that the Dodgers can step in and stop that from happening.
I would like none of those teams to be involved, just because I don't love this notion that we can just outspend everybody to a championship. The Moneyball narrative was really interesting, but we're still back in an age where now the people that spend the most money typically have the most success.
Right. Oh, this is not my ideal scenario. I'm just saying the best realistic case scenario might be another Dodgers championship in my mind.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for doing this. We'll talk soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Dean.